So I want to talk a bit about how I try to organize code in my system to plan for growth. Right, a lot of the discussions in here. How do you deal with systems that grow large? And um, Sebastian made a good point earlier about if you want to move to something like microservices, don't do it until you actually know you can structure an application well. So this is just some of the things that I've done to try to help manage the behavior in my systems. I'm Jim Gay. I'm Saturn Flyer on Twitter and on GitHub and other places. I wrote a book called Clean Ruby, and I'm working on, almost finished with the Ruby DSL handbook. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some things from both of these books. And I'm going to talk about this gem called Surrounded, which I wrote. There's the URL for it, and exactly how I use it. I like to visualize my code, and this to me is kind of what a lot of systems look like. There's objects that do different things. They share or have similar attributes, or sometimes they're completely different, but there's lots of different things in the system, and especially when you come into a legacy system or you bring a new developer onto your project, it's hard to communicate what's going on when they open it up and they see something like this. It's messy, confusing. But everything begins with one small feature, and that's, it's easy when it's at that point. So I want to talk about responsibilities, and the way we handle them can really make or break the experience for building software, right? You could break the software itself, but really the experience of how you manage the responsibilities in your system can at times be fantastic. If you're doing it well, it's easy to work with and change, or it can just suck the life out of you. So one of the things I want to talk about is creating barriers in your code so that it frees you up to make changes. Habitability and barriers. In my opinion, putting barriers into your code to prevent you from doing things actually gives you a lot of freedom. Has anybody read this book or heard of it? 1, 2, that's good. A few more. This is a book by Richard Gabriel. He was actually really influential in the Lisp program community. If you've ever heard the phrase "worse is better," it comes from him. It comes from the idea that you just make very simple systems and not over-architect your code. You can buy this the book. I think it's out of print, but it's actually a free PDF on his site. So if you go and search for Patterns of Software, which I suggest you do, go and take a look at it. I haven't read the whole thing, but there's a lot of good stuff in it. So here's a quote that I think is relevant to what we do. Habitability is a characteristic of source code that enables us to dive in and feel like we will have confidence to make changes. This is a bit of sample code I used in a presentation at RubyConf last year. It's kind of messy. It's okay if you don't really know what's going on, because I'm not going to walk through the entire thing. But it's grabbing values from objects and trying to create a string representation of an address. You have an address line and city and province and postal code, and it will try not to add certain values if they are not there. So if you don't have your street address, it will only include your city and postal code and that type of thing. But to me, looking at this, it doesn't really feel habitable. I can't dive in. I really wouldn't expect anybody else to be able to dive in quickly and see what's going on. So in my RubyConf presentation, this is how I solved it. This is just a solution to it. I decided to push all the responsibilities for formatting this information down into a template object. So that template takes care of understanding the formatting of the values. It accepts the address, and the address just sends itself down to the template method, and this is the person class that we had before. So we can see that the responsibility is being pushed down into this object. And this is probably a little bit easier to manage. If we want to change the format, we know exactly where we're going to be working with it. It's not somewhere high up in the hierarchy. It essentially looks like this, right? This is tell, don't ask. Just keep telling objects to do things, pushing responsibility down into the objects rather than querying information and parsing it outside of the object, right? The responsibilities are clearer. Has anybody heard of Christopher Alexander? He's an architect, okay, a handful. He's an architect that was really influential in a lot of people who've been thinking and writing about software design and architecture. And I think this is a relevant quote from him. Particularly with making buildings, it's really hard to plan for how it's going to be used in 100 years from now, right? Buildings are way more permanent than software. So the idea that even he, someone who works with buildings, thinks about building them in a way that they can grow over time is relevant to what we think about with our software. And this information comes from the Patterns of Software book. So later on in the book, after quoting some things from Christopher Alexander and talking about his thoughts, Gabriel says this: bugs tell us that we're not capable of producing a master plan, right? This is the same type of thing. We can't really figure out today what we need 2 years from now, or a year from now, or 6 months from now. It's really difficult to make that big plan, like a waterfall, and have everything execute perfectly. And usually the bugs that are created by doing that aren't really bugs because we have some sort of miscalculation. They're bugs because we didn't actually understand the problem well enough, right? So I'll show you the tool that I use to try to handle piecemeal growth. These are the goals that I'm going to talk about and that I had when I was working with this code. Most of what I wrote in it comes out of the research and experimentation I was doing when I was writing Clean Ruby and trying to understand DCI and how can I manage responsibilities in my system. So the goals: preserve existing object behavior, which really has to do with the DSLs that are inside of it and how you can use them, not use them, or extend them. Localize the behavior and then only apply the behavior when necessary. So I want this to be as non-invasive as possible. So the first one, this is just a simple example. This pattern you may find in your code, not specific to trying to implement DCI or anything like that. Initializing objects, you might end up doing something like this where you have to do a bit more, or maybe you have an alternative. You use modules, you use classes, whatever it may be. And I found that I was doing this a lot. So I wanted to make a shortcut because I did it often and I didn't want to type all that much, and it was always the same thing. And in actuality, what happens here is I keep track of the objects that are inside this class and what roles they're going to be playing, and I make a map of them so that I can reference them later. And the only reason I have this zip here is because that's actually what the implementation does. It looks a little bit more like this when it's actually executed. Right, so I keep track of the admin is the admin object that's being passed in, user is the user object. So I wanted to write it simpler. I just wanted to do that because I was doing the same pattern over and over again. So this is how I handled it. This is how I wrote the DSL. Right, it's just a simple class method called initialize. It takes a bunch of arguments of what objects are going to be passed in. So there's the adder reader and marking them as private. And then this is the initialize, right, where I had the map roles and zipping up the arrays. So that's the heart of it. But if I want to do something different, in the case where I'm not doing the exact same thing every time, I want to be able to preserve that existing procedure that I have, right? The algorithm for doing all of those things, I don't want to have to repeat it. I don't want to have to do this, add my special behavior, and repeat it all and lose the benefit of having that DSL method. So I wrote it in a way that would allow me to do something like this. Now, this is probably not something you would do for initialization in your code if you're going to do it, because you initialize once, and that's it. Defining a second initialize method is kind of strange, but I wanted to use this as a point to show you how it works. When I call super inside of this method, it actually points to the original implementation, right? If I've declared up above, I'll initialize with these two objects, then I can call super and reference what already exists. And this is really all that I do. So inside that initialize class method, it creates a module and defines the method on that module, and then inserts it into the hierarchy. So that's how super works. Essentially, this is what's going on. All right, so this is only a simple DSL. It covers 80% of the cases, but I allow for doing additional or separate things as well for the 20% that don't follow it. So, localizing use case behavior. It's really easy to think about coupling in particular with our code. We always talk about the dependencies that we have in our code and how to better manage dependencies. But cohesion is another aspect of that. This is really a couple. We always hear talking about coupling and cohesion together. And cohesion really has to do with the parts of your system, what they do, and how related they are, right? If you're both, if multiple objects have behaviors on them that are all related to the same thing, they're highly cohesive. If they have behaviors that are not related at all, they have very low cohesion. So managing cohesion is important because this quote, I think, really kind of sums up how you can think about managing changes in your system and how you can help it to feel habitable, right? When you come in, you don't want to have to go parsing through lots of different areas, tracing method calls, and trying to figure out what's going on in order to piece it all together in your mind. How much do you have to pack into your head before you can actually begin solving the problem that you came in to solve when you're going to look at your code? So, our programs do a lot, and there's a lot to consider. Each object is different. They have different responsibilities. But looking at all of them together, there's no clear way to figure out which ones are related, and you have to do a lot of digging. And sometimes you know that there's just a set of them that work together, and they sort of need to work together. So I want to build cohesive sets of behavior using the different objects in my system. And I want the features to feel habitable. I want to jump in and see all these highly cohesive parts, see them together. And I want to kind of compose them so that I can think about it in smaller terms. This is a simpler mental model for me. Right, so in the surrounded gem, this automatically maps these things for me. I followed this pattern where I would just make a module or a class or whatever it would be, and it would match according to the name. I provide ways around that if you want to use something different, but there's really no reason not to do that. So you can choose whatever implementation you want. You can do, put your methods inside of modules, or you can put them inside a class and wrap your objects. But one thing that bugged me is that I actually used this and decided I wanted to change my mind, and it was kind of cumbersome, especially if I had multiple modules defined or multiple classes defined, to switch them back. So I made a DSL that helped me do that, where I could just specify what it is. I'm just going to use a module, or in this case, I'm just going to use a wrapper. And for the most part, that didn't really change my code very much. I could focus on how relevant that change was and just go and fix my methods if they needed to behave differently. You can skip the DSL entirely. So it still works, even if you don't use it, right? It's an 80% case, and if you don't want to use it, that's fine. It doesn't matter which implementation you choose. You can make your own classes. As long as they map the name, it'll look for that constant and keep track of it for you. So what does it do? The context isn't just a namespace, right? It actually protects access and localizes the behavior. And this is really important because I don't want implementation details of how some business process works. I don't want somebody to go in and say, you know what, I need that. I'm going to use that over here and reach in, grab that module, grab that class, and use it in a separate place. Because then it really kills locality, right? You try to understand that other problem, and now you have to go search for another place for it. I want everything related to solving this particular problem inside this class, and I want it to stay there. If you find that you think you need some implementation inside here, you either want to use this object itself, you initialize this class and use that object, or maybe you just have incidental duplication of behavior. And it's not that you need to dry everything up and never repeat yourself. You might actually want to repeat yourself elsewhere because it's only similar, it's not the same. But this ensures that your business logic stays localized. But this is a hard limit provided by my DSL, right? So if you step outside of that, it's fine. You can share that behavior all you want. But by using that role method, it will make sure that everything is private. So with everything localized, what do I do with it? This is my third goal. I want to apply the behavior only when it's necessary. So this class is just like any other. There's really nothing special about it. It has a bunch of features inside of it. And you can define methods just like any other. And then this is the way I use them, right? So if I'm going to do something with the object that I create from the class, it will apply all the behaviors. So it will wrap the admin or it will extend it. Same with user or anything else that I add. And then does whatever I do in the method and will unwrap them. It will remove the behaviors afterward. And it does it in an ensure block so that if there's any kind of an exception or something like that, we always get to that line and make sure that it is undone. So I made another method for this. This just takes care of it for me. I make a trigger. I define it similarly to how I would do a method, but it makes sure that the objects, whichever objects need behaviors, are always wrapped or extended or do whatever we do to give them their behavior. So it does a little bit more than that as well, right? So if I initialize this, in this case, this user activation object, I can find out what the triggers are. Just the same, I can ask it for methods, but if I want to know what there is where these objects that are being passed in, when they will get these special behaviors, I can just ask for, well, what are all the triggers? And I actually have a way in here that I don't have an example of it, where you can guard against the triggers if some case is true or false or whatever it may be, and you can get a list of allowed triggers. And I've used that to build user interfaces, right? If a user is going to interact with some piece of my system, and I have several different actions they can take on it, depending upon what role they are, I might be able to display buttons for each action, but only 2 of them are actually available for them to click. But I can use my context for all of where I keep my business logic and define these are the actual things that you can do or you can't do depending upon who you are, and have that presented to the user as well. So if the systems that I make are growing through piecemeal growth, how can I manage the growth? The objects that I pass into my context, I want them to be able to talk to each other, right? I'm trying to treat this as individual systems. This is actually kind of a hard thing to do in really any programming language, so in some sense I have to fight against Ruby in order to make this happen. And when I was first researching DCI, I thought this idea was ridiculous and didn't do it. But I actually found some pain points where this really made me feel better. So in the case where I have this context, if I decide later on that I actually need to add another object to it, it kind of became difficult because all of the methods that might need to reference some of the other objects inside, their method signatures would have to change. And I would have to continually go back and change all the method signatures for each of these objects, or each of these methods. And that got really annoying. So I started looking again at the ideas in DCI and realized that I'd missed a major part of it, where these objects coming together are supposed to be treated like a system. They know about each other. So I went back and I implemented a way where it was just much easier. I could add other objects into the system, and they automatically knew how to interact with each other. So this is how I implemented it. This module is used to give the objects, it has some other things in it, but it gives them access to their current context, which is, in our case, the user activation. And it uses method missing to peer into its current context to see who else is there. So the reason I want to do this is, if I don't want to pass in dependencies to all of my method's signatures and make sure that it has access to each individual object, I want it to be able to say, if I hit a method that I don't know, maybe that's another object that I need to interact with. And so this is how I implemented it. And this is kind of crazy code that I imagine some people might say, I would never do that. So first, it's actually a predicate method that returns a non-Boolean value. You should never add a question mark to the end of a method and then return something other than true or false. And you definitely don't want to do a presentation where you show the code that you do that. So this is what the context has. It has an instance method where each object can ask, hey, is this named role inside, and can I access it? So first, if that role isn't there, it just short circuits and says, sorry, that's not in here. So it can continue processing method missing above and do what it normally does. So the last thing that happens is it will return the actual object as long as this object is an assigned player inside this role, this context rather. So the role map, when I initialize, I keep track of each of the roles, each of the objects that are playing that role, and any constants that give them their behavior. And so here I can ask that map for this particular name that's come in, admin, user, whatever it may be, is this thing in here? But this is the weird stuff. An empty block is passed up in method missing. And I use that to find out who the object is that's trying to access these other things, right? This is really the heart of trying to get these 3, 4, however many it is, objects and interact with each other so that they have a relationship just within this context, right? Only inside here, they can automatically talk to each other. And if I add behavior to one role or another, they can, command each other to do things. So I evaluate the string self on the binding of that block, and that gives me the actual object who sent the message. So up above on the top, it says context.role, and then those curly braces at the end, that maintains the knowledge of what the object is that's actually calling it. And then down below in here, this checks, are you in this context? Are you actually allowed to talk to the other objects that are in here that are currently being wrapped up with their behavior? Can you access the behavior for this use case? Because I want to keep everything local, right? I don't want external objects to start calling methods inside of this thing and have things occur without my knowledge, without me specifically adding it to my business logic. So only the objects that are in the context can access other objects. It's important to consider how accessible the implementation details are, right? Making constants private, or even sometimes private methods, a lot of Rubyists don't see that. I know there are some people who say, well, if I see any private methods, I immediately declare them as public and let me do whatever I want. And Ruby has I think a big culture of doing that. Just let me do whatever I want. So this is kind of weird, and honestly, standing here and telling you, if you use this, you're actually locking people down from getting access to things. I imagine a lot of people are going to say, that's crazy and I'm not going to try it. But still, you should try it and see how it feels. It works well for me. So this is a point that Gabriel makes in his book, that piecemeal growth is a reality, right? We don't begin by trying to make immensely large, complicated systems. We might know we have a complicated domain, but it grows over time and we learn. That's a lot of the discussion around DDD it's a learning process, right? Software development is not just executing some massive plan. So I like to use this tool because it allows me to grow bit by bit. I might think that I only have 2 objects interacting together, but then over time I realize there's a third or a fourth that has to go in there, and they need to do special things. So should you use this? I think this is a good quote. I don't know. It's probably not going to be perfect for you. You might find some cases where you think this is just crazy and you don't want to try it at all. But it grew for me. I tried initially doing a couple of things and didn't implement certain other ones, and then over time I realized that I had a need for it. So that's how I grew this. Not only that's how I grow my systems that use this, but that's how I grew the project surrounded as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Questions out there? Yeah.
So do you feel like it's pretty close to something like a bounded context? Like before you know the bounded context, you could use something like that, and then later when you are sure that it is indeed bounded context, you can like extract it, maybe even microservice later. Like this is something like you feel, okay, I got this behavior only in these few cases as an indicator that this is probably a different part of the system.
Yeah, and I don't really know DDD that well at all, but in listening to the panel, it made me realize that I think sometimes when people think about DCI, they don't recognize that an admin in this context is not the admin that's in the other one. So that I think is a really important idea, that just because you call it that doesn't mean it's got to share all the code in one place.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks.
How easy it is to test, to write tests for this? I mean, when you're using this gem, how easy it is to test the things you just implemented?
So this really has everything to do with just the composition of an object, right? You're making an object, and the goal of it is to try to take all of the processes, the algorithm for what's supposed to happen, and make it easy to see who's doing what and keep it all in one place, right? But that's still just an individual object. So you're going to initialize it, and you're going to tell it to do something. And you don't want to test its internal composition, which is why, in fact, I try to prevent you from even knowing about its internal composition unless you're looking at it. So you would want to, have the world the way it is, tell this object to do something, and check that the world is the way you expect it. So it's a black box, really.
Are the contexts and the use cases composable? And if not, how do you keep yourself from repeating yourself?
Often I will find that I either need to use this object inside another context. There's nothing preventing me from initializing a context and using that elsewhere. That's something that you can do as well, right? If one is responsible for doing a particular process, it may be a low level or maybe very high level, and I find that the high level ones tend to actually rely upon the low level ones, right? In terms of duplication, it may change over time. One of the things that I like about this is that I'm not pushing my code into a massive user class, and the user can do all of these things, because when you start adding methods there, they feel very permanent. But this, it's really cheap and easy to just make a new context and, in fact, try something different right inside your code and maybe swap it out for the one that you had before. So I often find that I write these things relatively quickly, but they're cheap, right? Because I'm not writing a method in the user class that someone else can depend on. And if somebody all of a sudden starts using the method that I only intended to be used in this one particular case, if I read it in a class, then I'm stuck, and all of a sudden I might break something if I change that. But in this case, everything is in one place, So I know nobody else, unless they're actually affecting this use case, is going to screw it up.
Thank you.
More questions?
What is respond to missing or something like that?
Oh.
I saw that in your code. Is it Ruby or is it your stuff?
No, it's Ruby. So if you ever define method missing, you want to ask that object if it responds to the message, it would say no. So you have to define respond to missing, and it will answer yes or no.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So what is your new book about? Is it about like using DSL for doing things like that, or what exactly?
So I'm writing a book called Ruby DSL Handbook, which over the last year or so, I've been doing a lot of client work that had to do with modeling QA automation, right? So I was interacting with systems and defining, and what I wanted to do as much as possible was just make declarative representations for what a page is or has or does. So I found that as I was teaching the developers how it worked, they would have a lot of questions about the structure of it. And so I tried to build it in a way where we could make it as flexible as possible. So similar, the whole reason I pointed out how initialize works is I want to make sure that everybody knows that if you're going to dynamically define methods, you should put it on a module and include the module rather than defining it on the class, because just by doing that one little thing, you now have far more flexibility. So it's just really, it's a very short book on just ideas like that to make sure that you don't cause headaches for yourself down the road.
Any more questions? Questions. All right. Thanks very much, Jim.
Thank you.